Superman 3. This is a movie that was a precedent setter. Not in many very good ways, but nonetheless, it was a precedent setter. The first really bad Superman movie, and the film that really established the expectation that in film series, the third one was the one where things really went to shit. And not just in superhero films either, because everybody thinks of The Godfather Part 3, for example, as the turd in that trilogy. Return of the Jedi is the least regarded of the Star Wars trilogy. Spider-Man 3 is thought of very poorly among the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Batman Forever, the third film after the in the Tim Burton Joel Schumacher Batman series, that is the turning point downhill for that Batman series. The third movie is very perilous in these series. I mean, even with Star Trek, I like Star Trek: The Search for Spock, but there is a large body of opinion that it is not a very good movie, or at least that it is a huge step down from the previous movie. So Superman 3 really is in that tradition, and really the movie that starts that tradition of the third film in a successful series being the one where it goes to shit. And it's a shame because it's following on Superman the movie, which is excellent, Superman 2, which is also excellent. Superman 3 is Richard Lester's opportunity to make his Superman movie. He is the credited director of Superman 2. He is who the Salkinds hired to replace Richard Donner after they had their falling out. And you can tell in Superman 2 that he has a very different sensibility, a very different style than Donner for Superman. But he is still in Superman 2 essentially sort of painting over what Donner had already done. It's not totally Richard Lester's movie. Undeniably, it bears his fingerprints, but it's not his. Superman 3 is his. Superman 3 is a Richard Lester movie through and through. And for the first time, we see, and thankfully for the last time, we see how utterly ruinous that Lester sensibility is to Superman. Because what makes Superman 3 such a bad film? And I think if I absolutely had to choose, I would say that it's the worst of the Superman series, Superman 3. What makes it so bad is that it is a failed comedy. And there's nothing worse than a failed comedy. Failed comedies are even difficult to enjoy, ironically. That's why you see so few failed comedies as episodes of Mystery Science Theater. Because it's just really hard to derive any kind of enjoyment from a bad comedy, from failed jokes. Who wants to watch failed jokes? Unlike Superman the movie and Superman 2, which were essentially adventure movies, romances, if you will, with comedic elements, Superman 3 is more of an action comedy. It's aiming for laughs. It's aiming for comedy. Has Richard Pryor, who was a big star in film at the time, and was already a legendary stand-up comedian, and his talent is never in question. But he has a very prominent role in the movie. It's just as much a Richard Pryor movie as it is a Superman movie, and that proves to be a poor decision. It's because they just don't give Richard Pryor anything funny to do. Richard Pryor is one of the funniest human beings who has ever appeared in any form of entertainment, for my money. His stand-up routines are just classic. He is the equal, if not the better, of George Carlin, Bill Cosby, Bob Newhart. Name any legendary classic stand-up comedian. Pryor is at their level or above. He's just absolutely in a class by himself. But as a film star, he has never been my favorite, and he just doesn't have much to do in Superman 3 that's worth seeing. He does his best, and he's able to come up with a few fleeting moments that justify his presence in the film. But overall, there's nothing here for him. It's just there's no reason for Richard Pryor to be here. It's a poor use of him, and it's a shame because he's all in this thing. And I think the main reason why Richard Pryor is so poorly used in Superman 3 is because Richard Lester's sense of humor is just so fucking awful. He's just, in this movie at least. I mean, I mentioned in the review for Superman 2, he directed A Hard Day's Night, which is a hilarious movie and a wonderful movie. But in Superman 3, there's no cleverness, there's no inventiveness. Most of the humor is the broadest, most obvious pandering slapstick you can imagine. It's just not funny. It's pained and strained and trite, and it's just awful. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work as comedy, and it tries much, much harder to be a comedy than to be a Superman movie. And it fails. It just utterly fails. It's a terrible, terrible movie. And that's really a shame. And it's a shame not just because its two predecessors were so good, it's also a shame because there are elements in Superman 3 that could have made a really good movie. For one thing, it has terrific performances. Christopher Reeve is still holding it down as Clark and Superman in what has suddenly become a thankless role. It's really a shame how shabbily Superman and Clark are treated in what is nominally their own movie, his own movie, I should say. And Annette O'Toole does a good job as Lana Lang in this. Robert Vaughn as the main villain is really, really excellent. Ross Webster, the evil business tycoon, he's sort of like the 80s or early 90s version of Lex Luthor, actually, in Superman 3. They all do really fine jobs. And again, as I mentioned, Richard Pryor, even though he isn't able to do much with his part, does as well as he could do. I mean, he doesn't embarrass himself in this. It's just that the movie gives him nothing to do. So good performances and elements of a really good story here. There's the idea of Clark returning to Smallville after living in Metropolis for many years. We get to see Lana Lang grown up with a child. We sort of fill in the gaps of Clark's life. You sort of get the impression when he's with Lana that you're seeing the real Clark. And it's something that you don't often see in this movie series. Clark in the Donner Lester series is always like an affectation. It's a disguise. He's pretending to be klutzy and cowardly, and really he's not. And in Superman 3, in the Smallville scenes, you see the real Clark. He's not pretending to be a doofus for Lana, because Lana knew him when he was growing up, and he's able to relax a bit more. He still does some comedy, he still does some sort of klutzy things, but not nearly to the extent that we see him do them in Superman and Superman 2. So you get the feeling that you're seeing the real Clark here, and that's intriguing. That's an interesting notion. And then the idea of turning Superman to the dark side. He's exposed to this counterfeit kryptonite that is sort of a callback to the different colors of kryptonite that we see in the comics in the Silver Age, like red kryptonite. It's sort of like that. It's a version of that. It's a synthetic kryptonite that is imperfectly duplicated from the real thing, and it makes Superman into a bad guy. It takes away his heroic motivation, and he just kind of becomes a jerk. And his costume gets dirty, and he stops shaving, and he just becomes a very selfish, lazy jerk. That is also an interesting idea. And it leads to probably the most memorable scene in this movie, where the two halves of Superman separate, and we have Clark representing the good Superman and Superman representing the evil side of his personality, and they sort of duke it out in a junkyard. And I still really like that scene. I still really like that battle. It's incredibly obvious. It's the most obvious way to present the inner conflict between the two halves of Clark's personality, between his good impulses and his bad impulses. But nonetheless, it works. It's a really well done scene. It's a really effective fight scene. With a lot of strong implications for the character. And of course, the good version of Clark wins out. We see Clark dressed in his suit, choking out the evil Superman and killing him. And then the dramatic reveal as he pulls his shirt open, and there is his Superman costume, pristine once again, and he's able to resume his duties as Superman, starting with going back, retracing his steps, and fixing all of the things that he messed up when he was evil Superman. So there are elements in this movie that could have been used in a really good Superman movie, and they're just wasted. It's just not there. They're buried under an avalanche of bad comedy, lame, stupid, unfunny slapstick, and a story that is worried more about the redemption of Richard Pryor's character than Superman. And it just falls flat. It just fails. It just doesn't work. There are moments that are nice. There are moments that I still sort of think about and quote to people, and we have a good laugh. Not even necessarily good moments, but just moments that are enjoyable. Moments where something lively or something entertaining, whether intended as such or not, breaks through the dreck and sort of reaches you and gives you something to talk about or something to latch onto. Like Richard Pryor realizing that his supercomputer that he has built is still active, even though it's been disconnected from the power source. And when he sort of puts together what's happening, and he has this wonderful shot of him where he's sort of looking up at the computer and he goes, "It's feeding itself. It wants to live." You know, I always think of that. Or the Superman remembering the acid from the chemical fire and bringing the acid back to destroy the computer. And you might think, like, how could the computer not have known that this acid would turn volatile if it were heated a little bit? Like, isn't this computer smarter than that? It's able to synthesize kryptonite that can kill Superman and then trap him in like a bubble, but somehow it doesn't know that this acid, if its temperature raises a little bit, would be corrosive and destructive. But, you know, it shows Superman using his brain. And I'm always a fan of that sort of writing, where Superman is able to solve the problem not by just punching shit, but by using his brain and outthinking, being smarter than the bad guys. Robert Vaughn has a lot of really good moments as Ross Webster, the stand-in for Lex Luthor in this movie, including probably the best scene in the movie, where he is talking to Richard Pryor's character Gus on the phone after he has exposed Superman to the fake kryptonite, expecting it to kill him, and it doesn't seem to do anything at first. Ultimately, it turns him into a jerk, but at first glance, it doesn't appear to have any effect on him. So thinking that he has failed, Richard Pryor's character, Gus, calls his boss, Robert Vaughn's character, Ross Webster, who has told him to kill Superman with this fake kryptonite, and he has to report to him that the kryptonite didn't work, that Superman didn't die. And with a wonderful deadpan, Ross Webster responds, "I sent you to kill Superman, and you're telling me you couldn't even do that one simple thing." And then he lets the phone sort of slide out of his hand and down the side of his face and drop onto the desk. It's just a really funny scene. An oasis in a desert of shit. Not a good movie at all, Superman 3. Not a good movie at all. Even Lois is gone from this one. I think there was conflict between Margot Kidder and Richard Lester, and she kind of didn't want to do this one, so they wrote Lois out. They had her be in the very beginning and say that she was taking a vacation to Bermuda, where apparently she spent the entire movie. Then she comes back right at the end when Clark comes back to Metropolis. And, it's just... It's Lester getting his shot to make his Superman movie, and he totally pisses it down his leg. It's just not a good movie at all. It fails as an adventure. It fails as a Superman movie, despite some potentially very interesting, very promising elements, and it fails as a comedy, which is really its worst sin. There's nothing worse than a failed comedy, and that's what Superman 3 ultimately is. It is a failed comedy. It's a really, really, really bad movie.